Jazeera's journalists from covering the talks in Manama. That's despite the network following all the necessary procedures to report on the summit. Al Jazeera's released a statement on the ban saying this is not the first time that Bahraini authorities have blocked Al Jazeera's journalists and reporters from doing their job. Al Jazeera condemns this measure, which is a deviation from the normal media protocols of host countries, and affirms that it will continue to cover news and events in Bahrain regardless of this ban. So let's get more from Jamal Elshayyal, who's in Doha now. And Jamal, you had tried to go to Bahrain to cover the summit for Al Jazeera, but were turned back.
Indeed, Mariam, as you mentioned there, and as Al Jazeera mentioned in the statement, as a media network, we filled in all the relevant application forms in the time frame that was allocated for media outlets that wish to cover this significant summit, and we sent them off to the Ministry of Interior in Manama, as well as the organizing committee behind the GCC summit. And we then carried on by traveling to Bahrain. I myself landed earlier in Manama, and when I got there, I filled in the immigration card, informing them that I was a journalist coming to cover this event, and the immigration officer then asked me to wait aside for around 20 minutes, and then he turned back saying that the translation of his words was that he spoke to the Ministry of Information, and the Ministry of Information said that Al Jazeera was not welcomed in Bahrain to cover this event. And when I asked why that was, he said the ministry claims that we hadn't submitted the relevant application forms. He said this was untrue, and in fact had printed copies of the applications which we filled in, yet that was to no avail, and I was turned back to return. So it was an unfortunate instance, because obviously as a media network it is our duty to try and bring news, relevant news, to our viewers. And as you've mentioned, this is a significant summit, not only limited to the Gulf region, but because of other international players who are also closely monitoring it. However, we will continue to try and obviously bring the latest from there, despite the restrictions imposed against us as journalists.
And Jamal, we know that there is a strong focus on the wars in Syria and Yemen at the summit. Tell us more about the opening speeches, what we've heard from the summit so far.
As you mentioned, obviously, as far as the Gulf countries are concerned, they share interests as well as perceived threats. As far as they're concerned, the main threat that they face is the Iranian involvement in the Gulf countries, particularly their support for Houthi rebels in Yemen, as well as even further afield from the Gulf region, but still in the Arab world, what's going on in Syria. So we heard strong statements from the King of Saudi Arabia, King Salman, who spoke of the need to bring about stability and peace in Yemen. Obviously, his country has been at war with the Houthis for around a year and a half now, as well as the statements we heard with regards to Syria. Their mutual interests expand beyond the economic interests, all of them being oil-producing countries, that is the GCC countries, as well as obviously gas-producing nations like Qatar. The King of Bahrain spoke of the desire to transform the Gulf Cooperation Council to some sort of a union akin to the EU. He spoke of having infrastructure projects that would connect the GCC together, so high-speed rails and so forth. So they were the main statements coming out from the opening remarks. But just very quickly to return to Al Jazeera's coverage, Mariam, one of the things that I think is important for our viewers to understand, obviously, is the fact that this is a very strange decision by the Bahraini authorities, because when international conferences take place, Mariam, those international conferences, the host nation doesn't put politics into it. So, for example, when the UN General Assembly takes place, or other international conferences, say in Europe, you'll find, for example, in the UN, you'd find reporters from North Korea or Iran attending, despite diplomatic confrontations between Washington and Pyongyang, for example, and other places. Or in Europe, you'd have some Russian journalists as well. So even whatever the politics may be as journalists, when a host nation prevents an international news organization from attending to try and bring about the news to its viewers, it sets a very dangerous precedent, to say the least.
All right, Jamal, well, thank you for explaining all of that. Jamal Elshayyal in Doha.